So we're on chapter 27, the last chapter, and we're going in to find out what's going on in Asia and the Pacific. And we're talking about Japan, Taiwan, Hong Kong, South Korea, Southeast Asia, onto Australia, New Zealand, India, and then into the Middle East. So let's begin. The Pacific Rim. So, the most dynamic economic sphere of the world's activity, even today, happens in the Pacific Rim. The Pacific Rim are those regions directly bordering the Pacific Ocean. Also, the region with intense national rivalries that could easily lead to military confrontation is in the Pacific Rim. In 1989, a group of 18 nations extending from Americas to Southeast Asia formed the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Group. And they call this group APEC, A-P-E-C. So it's basically a getting together in the midst of economic in this whole area and economy. APEC aimed to eliminate all trade barriers along the Pacific Rim by 2020. That means to take all barriers so that almost as economically could trade freely. Now it accounts for 45% of the world's trade. That's a lot of trade. A lot of things that you buy at the store will come from the Pacific Rim area. And they are now up to 45% of all of the world's trade. Japan. Mutsuhito to Hirohito. So, in 1867, Japan entered a modern age under Mutsuhito. He lived from 1897 to 1912. It's a picture of him in that far left corner here. Following American and European models, Japan quickly became an industrial power. However, Japan's desire to expand to Asia's mainland accumulated in World War II. As you remember, under Hirohito, as he was the emperor there, and you could see on the map here, let me focus in better here. You can see on the map here of Japan and how close Japan is to things. Here's North and South Korea, here's China, here's Russia. So all these countries affected Japan. And in World War II, of course, we know Japan, formed their alliance with Germany, Hitler. So we went over that last chapter. But anyway, Hirohito, the Emperor of Japan, 1926 to 1989, those are the years he lived, symbolized the role in Japanese life. And this has kept the Japanese in bondage to religions of Buddhism and Shintoism, because he definitely was involved in Buddhism and Shintoism. And as for Christianity, it became a barrier from bringing Christianity into Japan. But it also has been a conservative force linking the present to the past, because Japan was very into their past. They're relying on their past culture and living in that past culture, which prevented them really to get involved in the Western country, our modern country, but also kept them valuing a lot of traditional values, especially family values. But Japan under General Douglas MacArthur. General MacArthur became the military governor of Japan after World War II. His wise reforms and traditional Japanese virtues, basically letting them hold on to their traditional Japanese virtues, began to raise Japan out of the ashes of defeat. So here we have, Japan surrendering, being torn, in fact, atomic bombs dropping on Japan. But we have General MacArthur coming in and trying to recover, help Japan recover. And in doing this, we see how Japan greatly was pulled out of the pits of war-torn economy into one of the top economies in the world. But General MacArthur influenced these sweeping changes in Japan's economic, political, and social life. He came in and helping Japan as best he could. I know that General Douglas MacArthur was a Christian man, and we'll find out what he said about that. But he realized that Japan's real needs were primarily moral and religious. So he realized what Japan needed in saying very, very, very shortly what they needed. You'd say that Japan needed Jesus. That's what I would say. But General MacArthur, I love this quote by him. He says, "Whenever possible, I told visiting Christian ministers of the need for their work in Japan. The more missionaries we can bring out here, the more occupational troops we can send home, the better." The Pocket Testament New Testament League, at my request, distributed 10 million Bibles translated into Japanese. Gradually, a spiritual regeneration in Japan will grow. He knew the way to get Japan out of the pits and to help them was to start spiritually. And so he encouraged missionaries to come and brought 10 million New Testament Bibles that were translated into Japanese so that they could hear the gospel. Japanese prosperity. As a result of the rise in oil prices initiated by OPEC, remember what OPEC is? That's Arab nations controlling the oil, right? So in 1970s, and then Japan began a transformation of their economy. By 1980s, Japan became a major economic power in the world. Japan's prosperity was built primarily on American aid. Japan's economy raised the economies of all other non-communist Asian nations, and this hindered the communism religion as in the whole region. So basically saying that Japan, because they had a free enterprise government and they were doing well, the economies in the Orient there, with the exception of China, were looking at Japan and wanting to have that same kind of economy that was not controlled by communism. Japan had the second largest GDP, that's gross domestic product, in the world after the United States. So Japan was flourishing economically. Emperor Akihito and Japan. In 1992, Akihito of Japan visited the Chinese mainland. He was the first Japanese emperor to go to China in over 2,000 years. You think Japan and China are so close, but the emperor did not even recognize China until this time, for 2,000 years. The visit did mark a new era of cooperation between Japan and China. The Japanese the same year sent peacekeeping troops to Cambodia, the first time since World War II that Japanese forces were deployed outside of Japan. So here Japan is getting more involved in world affairs. But the threat posed by Communist China and the instability on the Korean Peninsula, which was mainly with Vietnam, meant Japan would have to rely on close alliances with the United States. By the 20th century, Japan was a powerful economic and political presence in Asian affairs. Now on to Taiwan. Okay, seeing the picture there of the map here in this right corner? Here's China and the China mainland, which is communist China now. And as you look in this little island here, this is Taiwan. This is, as you go up here, Japan. So Taiwan is here in the South. In 1996, Lee Teng-hui became the first democratic leader in Chinese history. Lee Teng-hui. He was elected as the new president of Taiwan. The Communist Chinese view Taiwan as a renegade province that must be reunited to China. To prevent the election, they led military exercises off Taiwan's coast. After American presence, they ended this but still vowed that Taiwan must eventually be integrated into Red China. Saying all this, basically the Chinese believe that they need Taiwan, that Taiwan now having its own economy, a free economy, they want to present communism back into Taiwan. So militarily, they are at odds. Even today, Taiwan is always in danger of being taken over by China. Taiwan's contrast to Red China. Although Taiwan has not the vast natural resources of China, the nationalist Chinese in Taiwan have, through hard work and free enterprise, developed a modern economy based on manufacturing and trade. The greatest asset is its climate of religious, economic, and political freedom. Taiwan stands as a free country against communism, in contrast to Red China. But its future is uncertain. Nationalist China in Taiwan was expelled from the United Nations in 1971 and replaced by Communist China. What? Yeah. Can you believe the United Nations? They took in Communist China, and because Communist China was at odds and enemies with Taiwan, they expelled Taiwan from the United Nations? That is very crazy, in the least, saying, to expel a free country because they wanted to take in Communist China, which they did. Although the United States had a permanent defense treaty with them, it repudiated it and ended relationships in 1979. So even America, because when we decided to be friends with our most favored nation of Red China, Communist Red China, we had to go against our friend Taiwan. That basically their whole representative government was based on America, and they were all pro-Americans. And for them to be kicked out of the UN and to be repudiated and let go of relations with the United States was very horrific, in the least. Hong Kong. So Hong Kong, as you see where Hong Kong is here, okay, Hong Kong down here is all China. Down here, here's Taiwan. On the mainland China is this city of Hong Kong. Hong Kong. The communist plan to take over Taiwan hinged on the treatment of the British colony of Hong Kong. This took place in July 1st, 1997. Hong Kong has emerged as a showcase for free trade and a success with minimum of government regulation. So Hong Kong looking towards free trade, to be free of the communist lifestyle in China. In agreement with the British, Communist China agreed to maintain Hong Kong's free industry and allow residents to govern themselves for 50 years. But doubts came that China would keep this agreement. Statements of the government of Hong Kong indicated a repression of the freedom there. So even though Britain had before controlled Hong Kong, it looked to democracy, it looked to free enterprise as the United States, and they had made a deal with China that Hong Kong would stay this way. Of course, we now have China threatening Hong Kong to take over and make Hong Kong communist, full-on communist part of Red China. So again, so even today we have the fights going on between Hong Kong and Taiwan, you know, onto Red China as they fight for their freedom even now, and stand for freedom. So this is and they're not really supported by the United Nations or the United States of America. So here's some pictures here. South Korea. South Korea enjoyed the fruits as a free enterprise nation, as we know, and it became one of the most prosperous in the Pacific Rim. In 1993, Kim Young-sam became the first civilian president since the early 1960s. You see here. Now, we already went over the Korean War, but we have how South Korea now, free enterprise country, democratic, and then the border here onto North Korea in the north. So they too, South Korea, are always at odds with North Korea being so close, and North Korea having nuclear weapons even today. So they're always on the alert of being taken over by this communist country, which is North Korea. The Philippines. We're going to talk about Ferdinand Marcos. The Philippines did not receive its independence from the United States until July 4th, 1946. It became the Republic of the Philippines. But poverty and discontent became prominent among the Filipinos due to the Marxist and communist agitation there. Ferdinand E. Marcos, president from 1965 to 1986, and that's when he fled the country, losing his military support. He was in control during that time. The assassination of his rival, Aquino, in 1983, stemmed a discontent of him because people thought he was involved in the assassination of Benigno Aquino. And but he was unpopular due to his martial law and his civil repressions. And he did, though, thought necessary to defeat communists. So we have Marcos and all kinds of, rivals going on in the midst of the Philippines during this time. Here's a picture of him. Here's where the Philippines is. If you look down through, we have Malaysia here, on east here. So, and we have the Pacific, the Solomon Islands. Philippines are right here in green. So they're north of Indonesia and south of Taiwan. The Philippines have always been America and stronghold. A lot of Americans are involved in the Philippines. Under the Philippines, Corazon Aquino. Okay, Aquino's widow, after his assassination, ran for president in 1986. Although she lost, she contested and became the president after Marcos fled. But her liberal policies resulted in an increase in communist insurgency. So she presumed the United States to withdraw its military bases. In 1990, the U.S. did withdraw from the Philippines. In 1992, Fidel Ramos was appointed as Aquino's successor and won the presidency. I think you could pronounce her name as Aquino. But anyway, here we go. The Philippines here coming again under socialism and communism, and that fight for being a free country onto being communist, socialist controlled. And she was very liberal in the policies towards communism, bringing Philippines closer to socialism than ever before. Indonesia, the Dutch Spice Islands. South of the Philippines is the Spice Islands. So let's look on our map here. You see where, as we go down here, we see the Philippines, and we see as we go down here, Indonesia. Indonesia is this whole area. They used to call it the Dutch Spice Islands, and the Netherlands controlled this area. So south of the Philippines is the Spice Islands, and these are the East Indies. They used to call it East Indies in the old days, where the European explorers would say, we're going to find the riches in the East Indies. They were much likely going to Indonesia. In 1700s, this was a Dutch colony, and it was called the Netherlands East Indies. After the Japanese surrendered in World War II, the Indonesian nationalists declared their independence. The Netherlands, the Dutch, recognized their independence in 1949. Indonesia declared the independence from the Netherlands. Sukarno and General Suharto. So Indonesia's first president, Ahmed Sukarno, governed as a dictator under this guided democracy. When we say guided democracy, it was a very socialistic, almost leading to communistic. The communists staged a military coup in 1965 after a series of economic and social disasters there. General Suharto of the Indonesian army put down this communist revolt, and he replaced Sukarno as the president and sought alliance with the West. The United States investments in Indonesian economy has brought stability there. So now the United States, we have a lot of investments in Indonesia now. So basically, Indonesia being that third world country, we've helped Indonesia immensely. And so here we have Sukarno and Suharto. And so you see how they too, are fighting against, in Indonesia, against the communist control. On to Malaysia and Singapore. Okay, Malaysia has two regions here. So we have this region, which is on the edge of Indonesia, and on to the peninsula. So the peninsula is in the west, and at the very tip of the peninsula there is the city of Singapore that we went over. So we have the peninsula of Malaysia there, and then we have onto the east, which they call this two areas of Sarawak and Sabah, and those two areas are in Malaysia. This whole area is Malaysia, and it's on northern Borneo. So this whole area, so you can look in the map. You can look at this other map down here and even see it clearly, where you see the peninsula is going from the peninsula onto Malaysia, two specific areas of Malaysia. And Singapore being right in the midst of that. So Singapore is a tiny colony at the southern tip of the Malay Peninsula. The Chinese are primarily, or I could say not primarily, there are actually a minority in the Malaysia Peninsula area, and they form an ethnic minority. So there's a lot of Chinese people living there. And these countries became prosperous under the British rule. So they too were once controlled by the Great Britain. So we see here this whole area, and we see Singapore right at the tip here, Singapore having its own type of government, and then we have the rest of us being part of Malaysia here. The Federation of Malaysia and Singapore. Okay, see this picture here again. We have here coming down from Cambodia, from this peninsula down into the Malaysian peninsula here, and coming up. And these are these two where it used to be called Borneo, and now we have these other Sabah and Sabah. After World War II, Singapore was made into a separate colony, crown colony of coming out of Great Britain, right? The Malay states were formed into semi-independent federations of Malay, and they gained complete independence in 1957, and Singapore complete independence in 1959 from Great Britain. In 1963, Malay, Singapore, and Borneo, Now Borneo, like I said before, is now called Sabah and Sarawak. Before it was called Borneo. And they united to form the Federation of Malaysia. Singapore left the Federation 2 years later and became an independent state. So Singapore is independent of them now. Both countries continue to prosper economically. The Federation of Malaysia and Singapore. Here's their stamp right here, a picture of their stamp. Thailand. So Thailand, as we can see here, is on the peninsula, Indochina Peninsula here, and you can see Thailand is very close to Laos and Cambodia and Vietnam. They all share this peninsula onto, as you see in the west, Myanmar here. So here we see Thailand in the middle of the peninsula and bordering down in the Gulf of Thailand here, and down, that goes down below. So you see Thailand. Thailand's official name is Muang Thai, or Land of the Free. It was called Siam before 1945 and changed its name to Muang Thang, Thailand. It is the only Southeastern Asian country never ever ruled by a Western power, so it has never been a colony before. After World War II, Thailand strengthened ties with the United States. So right now, even Thailand now has is very close with the United States of America. Thailand supplied troops to fight with Americans and South Vietnamese against the North Vietnamese at that time in the Vietnam War. So Thailand fought against the communism that was coming down into Vietnam. In spite of the constant threat of communism, Thailand is a very prosperous country. Picture of Thailand again. Myanmar, which was formerly Burma. Burma was made into a British province of India in 1880. In 1922, the Burmese became self-governing. In 1937, a separate British colony. So after World War II, Burma became an independent nation. After World War II, a lot of countries became independent. But social unrest and communist subversion plagued the nation of Burma. Just like other nations, the Burmese did not know how to really run their nation. And in the midst of all that communist subversion, they sent communist aggression into Burma. The Burmese military leader transformed Burma into a socialistic republic. And the Burmese Social Program Party is the only political party that's permitted. And they renamed the country the Union of Myanmar. Myanmar is the name of the country now, and it was Burma. And it's very socialist and been controlled by communism off and on, as we can see. But how it was renamed, they renamed. That's what happens when they come in, as for communist aggressors coming in, and they rename everything. So not Burma anymore, Myanmar. That's the end.